Picture this. You are standing in the middle of a slave auction, Charleston, South Carolina, year 1760. The sun is brutal, the docks smell like salt water and sweat, and in front of you, men, women, and children, chained together, just stepped off a ship that crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They do not speak English. They do not know where they are. They do not know if they will ever see their families again. Now here's the question that nobody asks. What if someone predicted this, exactly this, over 2,700 years ago? Not the general idea of slavery, not a vague warning about suffering, but the specific detail of ships, the specific act of being sold, the specific horror of having no one, not a single person, able to buy you back. What if that prediction is sitting right now in a book that over 2 billion people consider sacred? And what if most people have read right past it without realizing what they were looking at? Today, we are going to read one sentence, just one sentence from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 68. And by the time this video is over, you are going to understand why this single sentence has sparked more debate among historians, theologians, and scholars of African history than almost any other passage in the ancient world. This is not about religion. This is about history. This is about a document, a very old document, and whether that document describes, with chilling accuracy, one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Stay with me, because this is where it gets real. Let us read the verse together. Deuteronomy 28, verse 68. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Now before we go any further, let us talk about what kind of chapter Deuteronomy 28 actually is, because context is everything. Deuteronomy 28 is one of the most dramatic chapters in the entire Bible. It is a chapter of covenant. Moses is standing before the people of Israel. They are about to enter the promised land, and Moses gives them a choice. The first 14 verses describe blessings. If you obey, you will be exalted, your crops will grow, your enemies will fall before you, you will be the head and not the tail. But then comes verse 15, and from verse 15 all the way to verse 68, 54 verses, Moses describes what will happen if the people turn away. The curses start small: confusion, drought, failed harvests. Then they escalate: disease, military defeat, famine so severe that parents would turn on their own children. And then, at the very end, at the absolute bottom of this long, terrible list, comes verse 68. The final curse, the last one, the worst one: ships being sold as bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you, meaning no redemption, no buyback, no return. Now ask yourself this specific question. Does that sound like anything you learned in American history class? Drop a comment below. First reaction only. What do you see when you read that verse? Let us break this down phrase by phrase, because every word matters. Phrase 1. Into Egypt again. The first thing people notice is the word Egypt, and the first reaction is usually, well, that is just talking about Egypt, the country in North Africa, the place where the Israelites were enslaved under Pharaoh. But scholars and historians who have studied this text carefully point to something important. In ancient Hebrew literature, Egypt, or Mitzrayim in the original Hebrew, was not always used as a geographic reference. It was used as a symbol, a metaphor. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, the phrase house of bondage or house of slavery is used interchangeably with Egypt. Exodus chapter 20 verse 2, Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 6. The the word Egypt becomes synonymous with the condition of slavery itself. So when verse 68 says, "into Egypt again," a careful reading suggests this is describing a return to the condition of slavery, not necessarily to the geographic country. This is a standard interpretive approach used by scholars across denominational and academic traditions. The language is symbolic of bondage, of captivity, of being owned by another person.
With ships. Now here is where historians start paying very close attention, because this phrase is unusual. Think about the original context. Moses is speaking to a group of people who have been wandering in the desert for 40 years. They are a land-based people, a pastoral people, people who herded animals, who camped in tents, who navigated by stars across dry ground. The Bible itself records almost no maritime tradition for the ancient Israelites. They were not a seafaring civilization in the way that the Phoenicians or Greeks were. So why does this verse specifically mention ships as the method of this particular form of captivity? If Moses were simply describing being conquered by a neighboring army, which had already happened, why mention ships? If he were describing being marched into exile on foot, which also happened during the Babylonian captivity, why ships? The specificity of the word ships is what draws scholars to this verse. Now here is the historical reality of the transatlantic slave trade. Between approximately 1500 and 1900, historians estimate that somewhere between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. The voyage is known as the Middle Passage. Men, women, and children were loaded onto ships, packed so tightly that they could not sit up, could not turn over, could not move. They were chained to the wooden boards beneath them. The journey lasted anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on winds and weather. Historians who have studied ship logs from the era, including the records of captains like John Newton, who later became famous for writing the hymn Amazing Grace, describe conditions that are almost beyond human comprehension. Newton himself, before his conversion, commanded slave ships across the Atlantic. His journals describe the loading process, the conditions below deck, the deaths at sea. Estimates from historians place the number of Africans who died during the Middle Passage itself, on the ships, before ever reaching land, at somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. 2 million people dead at sea before they ever arrived. That is the historical reality of what ships meant in this context. And the verse in Deuteronomy says, "with ships." I want you to think about that, not as theology, just as history, just as a question of specificity. Tell me in the comments, do you think this level of detail is significant, or do you think it is coincidence? Let us have that debate.
Phrase 3. Sold as bondmen and bondwomen. In contemporary language, sold as enslaved men and enslaved women. Now here is a detail that most people overlook. The verse specifically mentions both categories separately, bondmen and bondwomen, men and women, distinct categories. In the transatlantic slave trade, the auction system that developed across the American colonies and Caribbean was not a single, undifferentiated process. Men and women were assessed differently, priced differently, and sold to different buyers for different purposes. Historical auction records from major slave markets, including those in Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, and Kingston, Jamaica, show consistent patterns of categorization by gender, age, and physical condition. Men were typically assessed for agricultural labor, field work, construction, physical output. Women were assessed for domestic labor, and also because the system was designed to perpetuate itself for their capacity to produce more enslaved people. The pricing structures reflected this. Auction handbills from the 18th and 19th centuries, many of which are preserved in historical archives, list bondmen and bondwomen separately, with different valuations. So when the ancient text says, sold as bondmen and bondwomen, it is not just using poetic language, it is describing a gendered system of human commodification, a system that would not exist for another 2,000 years after this verse was written. Now, phrase 4, no man shall buy you. This is the phrase that historians and biblical scholars find most striking. In ancient Israelite law, specifically the laws laid out in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there was a legal concept called redemption. If an Israelite fell into debt and was sold into servitude, the law provided a mechanism for release. A family member could step forward and pay the price to buy that person back. This was called the right of redemption, the kinsman redeemer. There was also the year of Jubilee, where every 50 years debts were canceled and enslaved people were freed. The entire legal framework assumed that captivity was temporary, that there was always a pathway back, that someone could buy you back. Now read verse 68 again. No man shall buy you. In the context of the ancient legal system this verse was written in, that phrase is devastating. It does not just mean no one will purchase you, it means no one will redeem you. No one will buy you back. The right of return, the legal escape valve, will not apply. You will enter a system with no exit. And that is precisely what the transatlantic slave trade created. Enslaved Africans in the Americas had no legal right of redemption. There was no kinsman redeemer. There was no year of Jubilee. There was no mechanism by which a family member could save you. In fact, one of the most deliberate strategies of the slave trade was the permanent separation of families, brothers from brothers, mothers from children, husbands from wives. Not by accident, by design. Because a person who has no family, no community, no one who can speak for them or buy them back is easier to control. No man shall buy you. 4 words, written over 2,000 years ago, describing a condition that would not exist in its most complete form until the 17th and 18th centuries. Now let us move from the text to the documented historical record, because everything I'm telling you is verifiable. These are not theories, these are not speculation, these are documented historical facts from primary sources. John Newton is one of the most well-documented slave ship captains in history. Newton made multiple voyages across the Atlantic as a captain of slave ships in the mid-18th century. His journals and letters are preserved and have been studied extensively by historians. In those journals, Newton describes in his own words the process of loading enslaved Africans onto ships, the confinement below deck, the iron manacles, the conditions during the crossing. Newton eventually underwent a religious conversion and became a vocal opponent of the slave trade. He testified before the British Parliament, and his testimony contributed to the movement that led to the British abolition of the slave trade in 1807. But what matters for our discussion today is what his journals document as a first-hand participant. Ships, chains, the Middle Passage, exactly as described. Historians working from ship manifests, customs records, colonial archives, and other primary documents have compiled what is now called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, a research project maintained by academic historians that contains records of over 35,000 documented voyages. The estimates drawn from this data suggest that between 12 and 15 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic between approximately 1500 and 1900. Of those, historians estimate that roughly 1 to 2 million died during the Middle Passage itself, on the ships, before ever reaching land. The peak of the trade was the 18th century, the 1700s, when over 6 million people were transported in a single 100-year period. These are not estimates from one source. These are conclusions drawn from the convergence of records from multiple colonial powers, British, Portuguese, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Danish, all of whom participated in the trade. In the American colonies and early United States, major slave markets operated in cities including Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and Richmond. Historical archives from these cities, many now accessible through university libraries and historical societies, contain thousands of auction records. These records categorize human beings for sale. They list age, gender, physical condition, and skill sets. Bondmen, bondwomen. These are not modern interpretive categories placed onto the historical record. These are the exact words used in the original documents. And this practice of categorized human auction continued in the United States legally until 1865, 157 years ago. This is not distant history. There are Americans alive today whose grandparents or great-grandparents were born into this system. Pause on that for a moment.
Now we come to the section that generates the most debate, and I'm going to present this as fairly as I can because there are serious scholars on multiple sides of this question. Here is the core challenge. How specific does an ancient text need to be before we take its apparent accuracy seriously? There are two camps in this debate. Camp 1 says the correspondences between Deuteronomy 28:68 and the transatlantic slave trade are remarkable, but they can be explained by the general nature of how oppression works across history. Conquerors use available transportation methods, markets develop to exchange human captives, families get separated. These are universal patterns of how imperial domination has functioned across multiple civilizations and multiple centuries. The specificity is apparent, not real. Camp 2 says the problem with that argument is that the verse is not vague. It does not say you will suffer. It does not say you will suffer. It specifically names ships as the transportation mechanism. It specifically uses the language of commerce, sold. It specifically distinguishes between male and female captives, and it specifically describes a condition of no redemption, which maps directly onto the legal structure of chattel slavery in the Americas, as opposed to other forms of historical slavery that did include redemption mechanisms. Both camps include serious, credentialed scholars. This is an active area of academic discussion. Here is the specific challenge that the second camp raises most forcefully. The people Moses was speaking to in Deuteronomy 28 had been in the desert for 40 years. Their entire lived experience was land-based. Unlike the Phoenicians to the north, who were legendary maritime traders, were the Greeks who built their entire civilization around sea travel, the ancient Israelites were not sailors. So why would Moses, warning his people about future consequences, specifically reach for the image of ships? If the warning were simply about conquest, the natural image would be armies, marching soldiers, siege weapons. That had been the historical experience of the region. If the warning were about exile, the natural image would be walking, being marched out of your land on foot. That is what happened during the Babylonian exile. But the verse says ships. Ships as a specific instrument of captivity. Ships as the mechanism by which an entire people would be transported to a condition of permanent, unredeemable servitude. That is a specific and unique image for that cultural context. Historians who study the ancient Near East note that ocean-crossing vessels capable of the kind of voyage described in the transatlantic slave trade did not exist in Moses' time. Large-scale ocean-going ships capable of crossing the Atlantic were not developed until the 15th century, 3,000 years after the composition of this text. How do you account for that specificity? That is the question.
I genuinely want to know what you think. Drop your perspective in the comments. Do you see this as a remarkable historical coincidence or as something that deserves deeper investigation? Let us have a real conversation about this. There is one more dimension to this debate that rarely gets discussed openly. The ancient Israelite legal tradition specifically provided for redemption, the kinsman redeemer, the year of Jubilee. Every other form of captivity described in Deuteronomy 28 operates within a world where redemption is possible. But verse 68 breaks from that pattern. It ends with a phrase that has no legal escape clause, no timeline, no mechanism of return. Scholars who read this verse closely note that the phrasing is structurally different from the other curses. The others describe suffering. This one describes a permanent condition. And that distinction between temporary suffering and permanent, unredeemable captivity is precisely what separated the transatlantic slave trade from almost every other form of historical slavery that preceded it. Let me be clear about something important. There is no academic consensus on what Deuteronomy 28:68 refers to. Mainstream biblical scholarship places the composition of Deuteronomy in the 7th century BCE and understands the curses of chapter 28 as referring primarily to events surrounding the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests. Within African American religious and scholarly traditions, particularly in movements associated with Black Hebrew scholarship and Afrocentric biblical studies, there has been significant interest in reading this verse as connected to the transatlantic slave trade. These scholars argue that the specificity of the verse cannot be adequately explained by the events of the Babylonian captivity, which did not involve ships. This is an active scholarly conversation, not a settled question. What is not in dispute is the historical record of the transatlantic slave trade itself. 12 to 15 million people, ships, auctions, permanent family separation, no redemption. Those are the facts of history, regardless of how one interprets the ancient text. Someone is going to ask, why are we talking about this today? Why does a verse from an ancient text matter to people living in the 21st century? And I think the answer is this: how we understand the past shapes how we understand the present. The transatlantic slave trade is not a distant historical footnote. Its consequences are woven into the economic, social, and cultural fabric of the United States. The wealth generated by enslaved labor funded institutions, built cities, and established family fortunes that persist to this day. The legal structures built to support slavery created systems of discrimination that did not simply disappear in 1865. The descendants of those men and women who were loaded onto ships are Americans. They are your neighbors, your co-workers, your fellow citizens. And for many of those descendants, the question of identity, of where they came from, of who their ancestors were, is not a settled question. The transatlantic slave trade specifically and deliberately destroyed the records of origin. People were stripped of their names, their languages, their family connections, their cultural identities. That erasure was not an accident, it was a strategy. So when a community of people in searching for their history turns to ancient texts and asks whether their story might be recorded there, that is not a fringe exercise. That is a deeply human response to an extraordinary historical loss. Whether or not Deuteronomy 28:68 is prophetically connected to the transatlantic slave trade, and that is a question I am leaving open because it deserves to be debated seriously. The act of searching for one's history in whatever documents survive is legitimate, it is honorable, and the questions raised by this verse deserve serious engagement, not dismissal, not mockery, serious engagement. So let us end where we began. One verse, 4 phrases: ships, sold, bondmen and bondwomen, no man shall buy you. A text composed, according to most scholars, somewhere between 2,500 and 2,700 years ago, and a historical event, the transatlantic slave trade, that took place beginning in the 15th century and continued through the 19th. There are three ways to read this convergence. The first way is pure coincidence. The verse was written about events in the ancient Near East, and the apparent connection to the slave trade is a case of pattern matching. Human beings are very good at finding patterns even where none exist. The second way is literary resonance. The language uses the condition of slavery in general terms, and because the transatlantic slave trade was one of the most extreme expressions of that condition in human history, the language naturally seems to apply. This does not require anything unusual. It only requires that the ancient writers understood human suffering with enough depth that their words still resonate across millennia. The third way is what a significant portion of Black American scholars, theologians, and historians have argued for decades, that this verse describes not just ancient events, but a specific pattern, ships, auction, no redemption, that was fulfilled in the transatlantic slave trade with a precision that the other two readings cannot adequately explain. I am not here to tell you which of those three readings is correct. That is your decision. That is what the comment section is for. But I will tell you this. The next time someone tells you that ancient texts have nothing to say to modern history, that old documents have no connection to the world we live in, remember this verse, Deuteronomy 28, verse 68. One sentence, three specific details, 2,700 years old, and a conversation that 12 to 15 million people and their descendants deserve to have. If this video made you think, if it made you question something you thought you knew, if it gave you a new piece of history to explore, share it with someone who needs to see it, because this history belongs to all of us, and the conversation is just getting started.